Welcome. Masters are talking. Subscribe.
Hey there, fellow deep divers. Ready for an adventure?
Always.
Well, today we're journeying to a mountain village in Cameroon, to the land of the Mbo people.
Sounds fascinating.
It is. We'll be guided by Fon Christopher's personal account, Mbu-My-Village, if you had a chance to look at it.
I have, and it's really more than just a history book, you know.
Okay? It's like stepping into his memories.
Exactly. You really get a feel for the culture, those vibrant stories, and even their unique food traditions. It's all in there.
Okay, so before we dive into the details, can you set the scene for us? Where are we in Cameroon, and what's the landscape like?
Okay, so picture this.
I'm ready.
A village nestled amidst rolling hills, about 20 kilometers from Bamenda.
Okay.
That's Mbo. And above it all, the Ezop Plateau and the majestic Meformasong Mountain.
Wow, mountains.
Now, you might expect a typical savanna landscape, right? But the kola nut forests
Kola nut forests. Interesting.
create this unexpected lush environment, almost rainforest-like.
Wow, a rainforest in a savanna zone.
Yeah. And it's not just beautiful, it really reflects the Mbo people's history, which is also intertwined with the history of the Bali people and, their control over kola nut production.
Okay, we'll definitely have to come back to that later then. But before we get ahead of ourselves, let's talk food. What are some of the staple dishes?
Oh, in Mbo, cocoyams are king. You can find them boiled, pounded, mixed with veggies, anything you can think of.
Really?
Yeah, but there's this one dish that really stands out.
Oh.
A pounded cocoyam dish with yellow soup.
Yellow soup. Now that's something I've never heard of. What's in it?
Well, get ready for this. One of the key ingredients is wood ash.
Wood ash.
Yeah, they filter water through it, mix the liquid with palm oil, and voila.
So is that what gives it the yellow color?
It does. It becomes this yellowish, surprisingly sweet soup. They call it eben, or sometimes iben.
Eben. Okay, I'll try to try that sometime.
It really shows how resourceful they are,
Yeah, I see that.
Transforming simple ingredients like that.
Definitely. But food isn't just about sustenance, though, is it? It often plays a big role in ceremonies and rituals.
You're absolutely right. And in Membo, food takes on a whole new meaning during these rituals. Like when a woman visits a new mother, she's offered Mbu-My-Village.
Mbu-My-Village.
It's burnt plantains mashed with palm oil and salt, a gesture of support for the new mom.
Okay, that actually sounds pretty tasty.
Yeah.
What about funerals? I imagine they have their own unique food traditions too, right?
They do. There's feku,
Okay.
boiled bitter leaf, goat meat, and lots of palm oil.
Sounds interesting.
But here's the thing. It's not just a dish. It's an obligation. Sons-in-law have to prepare it for the sisters of their deceased father-in-law.
Oh, wow. That's quite the responsibility.
Yeah, and the number of goats used. Well, that's a bit of a status symbol.
Aha. So food is about more than just flavor.
Right.
It's about social dynamics too.
Yeah.
Now, you mentioned earlier a debate about the name achu versus even for that pounded cocoyam dish. Let's unpack that.
Sure. So achu is actually a popular dish all across the northwest region of Cameroon. Basically, it's the same dish as Ambo's eben.
Okay.
But some villages claim achu originated from their dialects, saying the pounding sound resembles achu.
I can see how that would be a point of contention.
Yeah. Fon Christopher, though, argues for eben as the original name specific to the Mbo people.
It's like food becomes a marker of identity almost.
It really is.
And a source of debate.
Yeah.
Speaking of cultural identity, what else stood out to you about Mbo culture?
Well, one thing that struck me was their traditional dance groups. They're so vibrant.
Oh, yeah.
Yeah, like they have this lively bottle dance, often organized as a paid event on weekends.
I can only imagine what that looks like.
It's quite the scene, actually. Parents hire babysitters just so they can enjoy the music and dance.
Wow, it sounds like they really know how to have a good time.
They do, and it really points to a community that values its traditions,
Right. But it's not just about the bottle dance, is it? What other dance groups are there?
Oh, there's a whole range of them. You have Ndong, Masa, Idengo, Samba,
Wow.
each associated with specific families. And they often incorporate financial activities into their gatherings,
Oh, interesting.
like Njongi or Ikom. So it's a way of weaving economic support into their cultural practices.
Right, I see. That's really cool.
Then there's Ngwa.
Ingwa.
Yeah, it's a form of musical social commentary. Women compose these songs to address community issues.
Wow, so it's like their way of raising awareness through music.
Exactly.
That's powerful. Now, you mentioned earlier a secretive women's dance group called Bang,
Yeah.
right? Can you tell me more about them?
The Rekambing are definitely a bit mysterious. They focus on themes of childbearing and catering,
Okay.
but their gatherings are strictly for adults. And rumor has it, things can get quite risque.
Risque.
It's believed they use these gatherings to discuss strategies for childbearing and to address issues related to men who are causing trouble.
I see. So it's about maintaining order in a way?
It is. Interestingly, they also play a role in protecting their farms from animals.
Really?
So you see their connection to both social and agricultural aspects of life.
That's fascinating. Now, before we move on, you mentioned masks earlier.
Yeah.
What role do those play in Mambo's traditional dances?
Masks in Mbo hold a special significance. They represent spiritual power, almost like juju, but they're also very secret.
Oh.
Women and children are forbidden from seeing them.
Wow. Why is that?
Well, the men perpetuate this myth that the masks live in the river.
In the river.
Yeah, and they only come out for performances. Keeps the mystique alive, you know?
I can imagine. And I bet it keeps the kids from recognizing their dads under those masks, too.
Uh-huh, exactly.
Now, shifting gears a bit, can you tell me about the Kwaifon? What's their role in Mimbo society?
The Kwaifon, they're like the guardians of Mimbo, the security force, judges, and even spiritual advisors all in one.
Okay, that sounds important.
But it's not just one person, it's a whole group.
Oh, interesting.
And they have a very specific hierarchy. The highest level is the Kwaifon Budsambe.
Kwaifon Budsambe.
7 members, so secretive that even the Fon, the village chief, doesn't get to see them.
Wow.
They hold immense power. They can even impeach the Fon. And before they do anything serious, they have to go through 7 days of spiritual cleansing.
7 days. What does that involve?
No cooked food, no contact with women. It's serious business.
Wow, that's dedication.
It is.
What about the other levels of the Kwaifon?
The second level is the Kwaifon Menwai.
Kwaifon Menwai.
9 members. They're in charge of cleansing the village in various situations. Except for suicides. Those are handled differently.
Okay, so they have specific roles then.
They do. Then you have the most visible level, the Kwaifon and Nafambon, which literally means many children.
Many children. That's interesting.
They're present at celebrations, death celebrations, and things like that. They interact more openly with the villagers.
So it's like a multi-layered system of maintaining order.
That's a great way to put it, both spiritual and practical.
Fascinating. Okay, so we've explored a lot about Mbo's present-day culture, but let's take a step back in time. Where did the Mbo people come from historically?
Well, we need to look at the Bantu migration, a massive movement of people across Africa that began thousands of years ago. The Mbo are part of this vast Bantu heritage, sharing cultural and linguistic ties with other Bantu groups, and it's this migration that ultimately brought them into contact with the Bali people.
The Bantu migration. That sounds like a huge topic.
It is. Imagine groups of people skilled in agriculture and ironworking, gradually moving across the continent over centuries, driven by all sorts of things like resource scarcity, population growth, even maybe climate change. As they moved, Bantu languages and technologies spread. Along the way, they encountered other groups leading to, well, both collaboration and conflict.
It's incredible to think about the scale of that movement and how it shaped Africa as we know it. But let's get back to the Mbo people specifically. What about the impact of the slave trade on their region?
Sadly, the slave trade cast a long shadow over the region.
Yeah.
Many Mbo people were forcibly taken. This history still resonates in the demographics and the social dynamics of the region.
It's a sobering reminder that to understand the present, we need to acknowledge the past.
Absolutely.
Now, I understand the Mbo people trace their lineage back to specific Fons who led them during their migrations. Tell me about these leaders.
The line of Fons is really like a living chronicle of their journey. Each one played a role in shaping their community. But there's a shift after the 8th Mfon in Gierzak. His successor, Mokoruka I, is the first to have that first designation.
Marking a change in their naming conventions.
Right, and it raises the question, what prompted this?
Yeah, what did happen?
It's fascinating to consider all the possible influences at play. The arrival of Christianity, internal power dynamics, family struggles. All of these things might have contributed to this transition, and the Renjoh family especially becomes central to understanding this period.
So let's talk about them then. What makes their story so important?
Fon in Gierzak had a very specific leadership style. Known for his love for his many children, he fostered a strong sense of unity among them. They were so close, in fact, that villagers called them Bon Conredi, meaning children from the weaver bird's nest.
Like those birds known for their communal lifestyle.
Exactly. But this unity also sparked jealousy and fear. Sadly, this led to a disruption of the traditional hereditary rule after his death.
It seems that their unity was perceived as a threat.
It was.
So what happened after Jirizog passed away?
Well, bypassing his sons in the line of succession caused turmoil, misfortune even. They consulted the oracles, and it became clear that their actions had angered the gods.
Oh, no.
To appease them, they had to appoint one of Njerizok's sons as Indi Fon Mevu, a special title to rectify the disruption.
So they had to find a way to restore balance.
They did.
Now let's talk about the dance Renjoh. What's the story behind it?
Rekhamgang is owned by the Fon himself, and it's only performed after major festivals, like near. Unlike other dances, it reenacts a historical event, one that really shaped the village's identity.
A dance that tells a story.
Exactly. It takes us back to when Mbo was still called Baforchu. The then Fon, Achu, had an older brother named Akum. Achu caught a goat for a meal, but it belonged to Akum. And to make matters worse, Akum had just caught a leopard, hiding the skin in the palace hall, where he also found his stolen goat.
Oh, that's adding fuel to the fire. So what happened next?
An argument, of course, and in a moment of anger, Achu threw the leopard skin under the sacred fig tree.
The place where the Fon communed with the ancestors.
That's right, a serious act of disrespect.
What happened then?
Well, nobody dared touch the skin. It was left there to rot. The village was divided, some siding with Achu, others with Akum. Finally, Akum confronted his brother, asking for a knife to skin the leopard, but Achu, still angry, tossed him a blunt knife used for palm wine. A clear insult.
Oh, I see where this is going.
Akum, with his supporters, took that knife and skinned the leopard anyway, defying tradition and Achu's authority. Empowered, he and his followers decided to break away.
To form their own village.
Yes, they called it Mbe, named after that palm wine knife, and that's the story Rekhamgang tells.
So it's a living memory of that split.
It is.
You mentioned that the song itself tells a story too. What are some of the lyrics?
The song starts with Mecho e Rekhamgang nageye mimbi, which translates to, what can I give to Rekhamgang? The chorus responds, hi ahi hi. Then it goes, Achu echifan akum echifan, meaning Achu has taken the crown and Akum has also taken the crown. And again, the chorus, hi ahi hi. Finally, the song asks, Akuenaf yembebamon Akwenritu, meaning, what is wrong with the children of Akwenritu? And once again, the chorus, hi ahi hi.
Those lyrics are really haunting. You can feel the pain of that division. Now, did this pattern of family feuds splitting villages continue?
As a matter of fact, yes. A similar incident involving Akum's eldest son, Forba, led to the birth of yet another village. He wanted to protect his wives from advances from the Fulani people living on the hills. So he asked his father for cowries, symbols of power, to place on his wives' heads as a deterrent. But his father refused, saying only chiefs could bestow cowries.
So it was about authority.
It was.
So what did he do?
Well, Forba turned to his uncle, Fonachu, who agreed to give him the cowries. This, of course, made Akum furious, leading to another split. Forba and his followers established their own village, Baba II.
So again, we see this recurring theme of power struggles and how seemingly small things like these cowries can lead to major societal shifts. You mentioned before that the Bali people occupy land that once belonged to the Mbu people. Can you tell me more about that?
This is a complex issue. You see, before the Bali arrived, the area that is now Bali was the Mbu people's hunting ground. Their migration from Ancon had led them to this land.
So the Bali people's arrival disrupted their way of life.
They did. The Bali people were themselves migrants. They had journeyed from northern Nigeria, led by a princess, Ganyonga, and her son, Young Pasi.
Okay.
They were a warrior society, skilled in horseback riding and archery. Very different from the Mbu, who used spears for close-range fighting.
A clash of cultures and military strategies.
It was. Initially, the Mbu underestimated the Bali. They even had a legend about a magical bird, Mbu-My-Village, that could breathe fire on their houses.
A magical bird.
It's a fascinating legend.
I bet.
But legends don't win wars, do they? The Bali, with their superior weaponry, began to gain ground.
And then the Germans arrived.
Exactly. The Germans saw the Bali as more civilized and allied with them. This forced the Mbu to relinquish their land and retreat.
Must have been a difficult time for them.
It was a turning point in their history.
It's a sad reminder of how external forces can reshape destinies. But before we move on, I have to ask, what's the story behind this magical bird?
Mbu-My-Village embodies their defiance, their hope against a powerful enemy. It's a testament to the power of storytelling, how it shapes cultural identity.
Right, even in the face of adversity. Now, Fon Fon Christopher mentions that the Mbo believe their current location is a blessing because of the abundance of kola nut trees. Can you talk about the significance of kola nuts for them?
Kola nuts are much more than a source of income for them. They represent a connection to their history, their land. They never knew who planted those trees.
Right, you mentioned that earlier.
They attributed it to squirrels, but Christopher suggests they might have been planted by, get this, Neanderthal man.
Wow.
Adds a whole new layer to the story, doesn't it?
Really does. Okay, tell me more about this kola nut season. What are the rituals and practices surrounding it?
The season coincides with the rainy season. It's a time of celebration, but also strict adherence to tradition. The Recumbing women, especially, play a big role.
In what way?
They perform special songs and rituals to ensure a bountiful harvest.
A blend of spirituality and practicality. What are the rules surrounding gathering kola nuts? You mentioned the serious consequences for breaking them.
The rules are taken very seriously. First, you can only climb a tree that you personally planted. Climbing someone else's could lead to a fatal fall.
Oh, wow.
Then, using sticks to knock them down. Also forbidden. It could bring everlasting pain to your arm. And lastly, no searching for them at night with any kind of light. It has to be done in darkness.
So they believe in respecting nature and the consequences of their actions.
You do.
But if you can't use light, how do they gather them in the dark?
The children head out before dawn. They rely on sound, not sight, to find them.
That must take some skill.
It does. They learn to distinguish between the sounds of empty shells filled with something else, and the ones filled with kola nuts.
Wow, incredible. Now, while the kids are out, what are the adults up to?
The men, particularly the Kwifon and elders, perform protective rituals, mixing concoctions, chanting, marking the entrances to their compounds.
So everyone has their role to play.
It's a true community effort.
What other childhood memories does Fon Christopher share? What was it like growing up in Mbo?
Oh, he describes the joys of playing games in the moonlight, going to fetch firewood, searching for wild fruits.
That was idyllic.
They were resourceful, too.
Yeah.
Hunting for mushrooms, collecting beetles and roasting them for snacks. They even used some beetles like the chong as toys.
Boy.
They'd tie them to strings and fly them around like miniature airplanes.
Uh-huh. I love it. Now, what about those woody bicycles you mentioned?
Oh, right. Those were their homemade bikes, made from branches and whatever they could find.
So creative.
They were. And they had a swing called Renjoh, made from ropes strung between hillsides.
Sounds fun, but a little dangerous.
It was.
Did they have any chores to do, or was it all just fun and games?
Weekends were a different story. That's when they had to contribute to the family. Coffee farming, mainly.
So it wasn't all carefree.
It wasn't, but it taught them responsibility.
What was coffee farming like?
Backbreaking labor, clearing weeds, often barefoot, their hands blistered. And during harvest season, in the dry months, the mornings were freezing. Plus, mosquitoes and all sorts of bugs in the evenings.
I can only imagine. What was the reward for all that hard work?
Very little, actually.
Yeah?
Barely enough to cover basic needs.
It sounds like a tough life. Now, you mentioned the trip to Santa to sell produce was particularly dreaded. Can you describe that journey?
Imagine waking up before dawn, a heavy basket on your head, and walking for kilometers, often barefoot.
Wow.
The road was rough, the journey long, and all for very low prices at the market.
It really puts things in perspective. Now, let's shift gears and talk about security and justice in Mbo. How do they maintain order?
The Council of Elders played a key role. They met every Mban, their designated day for meetings and a public holiday. It was also a market day, so it provided a good platform for resolving conflicts.
Right.
For urgent matters, the Kwifon would make nighttime proclamations, walking through the village, shouting announcements.
Talk about dramatic.
They also used a wooden drum. Each rhythm conveyed a specific message.
Okay, so their own version of Morse code. What about resolving disputes, like land infringement?
Land disputes were settled through a ritual called Chai Mebon.
Okay.
The person whose land was being encroached upon would cut a specific plant, then they'd pin it down on the disputed land.
Like a warning.
Exactly. If the encroacher continued, then it went to the Council of Elders.
Makes sense. How do they protect their crops from theft?
They used something called chep, placing sticks with scary ornaments or sometimes imbued with curses around their farms.
Another example of blending practicality with the spiritual world.
Right.
Now, earlier you mentioned etchop and ebonu. Can you explain what those terms mean?
Etchop refers to harmful actions, things that could lead to death or trauma. They viewed these as spiritual transgressions.
So it wasn't just the physical act, but the spiritual impact as well.
Precisely. Which is why they needed ritualistic cleansing to restore balance.
I see. And how does ebonu differ?
Ebonu refers to acts that result in death, often suicide. These were considered particularly polluting.
Requiring special cleansing.
Yes, by the seven-man Fon.
Okay. What did those cleansing rituals look like?
They would collect pebbles from the site, prepare herbal medicines, and perform incantations. And it always ended with a communal feast.
A symbol of restoring harmony.
Exactly.
Now, let's talk about the arrival of Christianity in Mbu. What kind of impact did it have?
It definitely marked a shift in their religious landscape. The Catholic and Presbyterian churches offered different ways of understanding the world.
What were some of the key differences between Christianity and their traditional beliefs?
Well, the concept of one God, for example, was very different, as was the idea of original sin. And the teachings on heaven and hell also contrasted with their traditional understanding of the afterlife.
So how do they reconcile those differences?
The Catholic Church, to their credit, used pidgin English in their teachings.
That's a great way to bridge the gap.
It was. They often used a question and answer format to explain things. Like for baptism, they'd ask, "Waity be baptism," which means, what is baptism?
And the answer.
Baptism be sacrament, we ID move original sin from we skin, ID make we Christian pickin' for God and for church. So it removes original sin and makes you a child of God.
I like how they simplified it. Did the villagers fully embrace these Christian doctrines? Or did they find ways to blend them with their existing beliefs?
I think it varied. Some might have converted fully, while others took a more syncretic approach, blending elements of both.
That makes sense. Now let's move on to marriage traditions in Mbu. What can you tell us about them?
Traditional marriage in Mbu is known as country marriage. It's very much rooted in Bantu culture, emphasizing the union of individuals and the creation of a new household.
Sounds like a community affair. What were the steps involved?
First, the groom would tell his family about his chosen bride.
Okay.
The family would then evaluate the proposal, looking at things like the bride's family's reputation.
So it's about compatibility between families too.
Very much so. Once it gave their blessing, the groom's family would approach the bride's family with gifts.
Like what?
A fowl, firewood, maybe a goat, plantains, oil, palm wine, that sort of thing.
A way of showing their sincerity.
Exactly. Then they would arrange a meeting between the families, and they would use humorous dialogue to ask for the bride's hand.
Really? Like what?
They might say they've come seeking a precious pearl they spotted in the compound, or a beautiful hen they want to take home.
I love that. It's a fun way to approach such a serious matter.
It is. And if the bride agrees, they proceed with a wine-sharing ceremony.
Okay.
The bride's father opens a jug of palm wine, pours a cup, and offers it to her. She takes a sip and then offers the rest to the groom.
A simple yet powerful symbol of agreement.
It is. Later that evening, the bride is escorted to the groom's compound.
With a procession.
Often, yes. Lit by bamboo torches.
How beautiful.
And at the entrance, her escorts demand a tip before letting her in.
Adding a touch of playfulness.
Right. Once she enters, the groom's family welcomes her and anoints her with palm oil.
A symbol of acceptance.
Exactly.
Now, you mentioned before that Fon Christopher also includes poems in his book. What themes do they explore?
The poems are his personal reflections on a range of things: Africa, love, spirituality.
Okay.
They offer a deeper layer to the book beyond just the ethnographic accounts.
Can you give me an example?
His poem, Africa, is particularly moving. He acknowledges the continent's struggles, but also celebrates its resilience and beauty.
It's a reminder of the complexities of the continent.
Right. He also explores the nature of love. In a poem simply titled Love, he describes it as a force that's both blind and wise, foolish and rich. It's a beautiful reflection on the power of love.
That's a theme that resonates with everyone.
It does.
Is there anything else about the poems that stood out to you?
Well, I thought it was interesting how he uses them to bridge the gap between traditional wisdom and modern perspectives. He draws on his Mbu upbringing, but also addresses contemporary issues.
So he's navigating both worlds.
He is.
Okay, let's start to wrap up our discussion of Mbu-My-Village. What are your final thoughts?
The resilience and adaptability of the Mbo people is truly remarkable. They've faced so many challenges, yet held on to their values and their identity.
They found a way to adapt without losing themselves.
Exactly.
It's inspiring. It makes you think, considering their history, what lessons can we learn from them about preserving cultural heritage, especially in a world that's constantly pushing for homogenization.
The Mbums remind us that cultural heritage isn't static. It's alive, it evolves. Preserving it requires balance, honoring tradition while adapting to change.
Finding ways to integrate new ideas without erasing what makes a community unique.
Exactly. And passing on that knowledge to younger generations, empowering them to be the caretakers of their legacy.
That's such an important message. It's not about clinging to the past, but about keeping it relevant for the future.
Well said.
This deep dive into Mbu-My-Village has been incredibly enriching. Thank you so much for sharing your insights and guiding us through it.
It's been my pleasure. I'm always fascinated by cultures that find a way to stay true to themselves in a globalized world.
Before we go, we want to leave our listeners with something to think about. Considering the Mbo people's experiences, how can we each contribute to preserving cultural diversity in our world?
I think it starts with recognizing the value of diversity, understanding that different ways of life, different perspectives, they enrich us all. We need to be curious, learn from each other, and challenge our own assumptions.
Fostering empathy and respect. Celebrating our differences while acknowledging our shared humanity.
Exactly. And supporting initiatives that promote cultural preservation. Language programs, festivals, documentation of traditions. There's so much we can do.
It's about taking action, individually and collectively, to ensure that the richness of human culture continues to thrive.
Well said. It's about celebrating, sharing, and passing on that heritage to future generations.
This has been an amazing journey. We encourage our listeners to share their thoughts with us on social media. And as always, thank you for joining us on the deep dive.
They used chep. Basically, they'd place sticks around their farms.
Okay.
But the sticks would have, like, scary ornaments on them.
To scare off thieves.
Yeah. Or sometimes they'd be imbued with curses.
Oh, wow.
So again, that blend of practicality and spiritual beliefs.
Right. Now, you mentioned Etchop and Ebenu earlier. In relation to their system of justice, what do those terms mean?
So Etchop refers to harmful actions,
Okay.
things that could cause death, serious trauma. They saw these as spiritual transgressions.
So it wasn't just about the physical act itself.
Right. It was about the spiritual consequences,
Yeah.
disrupting the balance of the community. So they needed rituals to cleanse and restore that balance.
That's a very different approach to justice.
It is.
And Ebenu, how is that different?
Ebenu is specifically for acts that result in death,
Okay.
often self-inflicted, like suicide.
And those were considered even more serious.
They were. They required a special cleansing by the seven-man Kwefon.
The most secretive level. What did those cleansing rituals involve?
They would collect these pebbles, called fetchum, from the site, prepare herbal medicines, perform incantations to appease the spirits, and then it would always end with a communal feast.
To symbolize that restoration of harmony.
Precisely, bringing the family back into the community.
Now let's talk about the arrival of Christianity in Mbo. How did that impact their existing beliefs?
It was a major shift. The Catholic and Presbyterian churches introduced a whole new way of understanding the world.
What were some of the key differences they had to grapple with?
Well, the idea of one God, for example, was very different from their belief in multiple spirits and ancestors.
Right.
The concept of original sin was also completely foreign to them. And then there were the teachings on heaven and hell, which contrasted sharply with their traditional views on the afterlife.
So how do they make sense of all of this?
The Catholic Church, smartly, used Pidgin English in their teachings.
To make it more accessible.
Exactly. And they often used a question and answer format.
Oh, interesting.
Like, to explain baptism, they would ask, "Waity be baptism?"
Meaning, what is baptism?
Yes. And they'd answer with, "Baptism be sacrament, I de move original sin from we skin, I de make we Christian pickin' for God and for church."
So basically, it removes original sin and makes you a child of God.
Exactly.
Do you think the villagers fully embraced these new doctrines? Or did they blend them with their existing beliefs?
Probably a mix of both. Some might have converted entirely, while others might have found ways to integrate the new ideas with their traditional practices.
It's fascinating how cultures adapt to new influences.
Yeah.
Now, let's talk about marriage traditions in Gumbo. What was their approach to marriage like?
They called it country marriage.
Country marriage.
It's a very important part of Bantu culture. They emphasize the union of the two individuals and the creation of a new household.
Sounds like a very community-oriented approach. What were the steps involved?
Well, it started with the groom telling his family about the woman he wanted to marry. Then the family would evaluate the proposal. They would consider things like the bride's family's reputation and whether there were any potential conflicts.
It's about more than just the couple's feelings for each other.
Oh, definitely. It's about the families, too. And once the groom's family approved, they would approach the bride's family with gifts.
What kind of gifts?
Things like a fowl, some firewood, maybe even a goat, plantains, red oil, palm wine.
A way of expressing their good intentions.
Exactly. Then they would arrange a meeting between the two families. And this is where it gets interesting.
How so?
They'd use this very humorous dialogue to ask for the bride's hand in marriage.
Really? Could you give me an example?
Well, they might start by saying that they've come looking for a precious pearl they saw in the compound.
Oh, I love that.
Or they might say they want to take home a beautiful hen they saw.
It's a clever way to bring a bit of levity to the situation.
It is. And if the bride agrees, then they would have this wine-sharing ceremony.
Okay, tell me more about that.
The bride's father would open a jug of palm wine and pour a cup. He'd offer it to the bride first, and she'd take a sip.
Symbolizing her acceptance.
Yes. And then she would offer the rest of the wine to the groom.
Completing the agreement.
Exactly. There would be a celebration at the bride's house, and later that night, she would be escorted to the groom's compound.
Was there a procession?
Often, yes. They would light the way with bamboo torches.
That's a beautiful image.
It is. And then, when they arrived at the groom's compound, the bride's escorts would demand a tip before they would let her enter.
Okay, so a bit more playfulness.
Right. And then once she entered, the groom's family would officially welcome her. They'd anoint her with palm oil.
To symbolize her new role in the family.
Exactly.
Now, you mentioned earlier that Fon Christopher also includes some of his own poetry in the book.
He does.
What kind of themes does he explore in those poems?
Oh, all sorts of things. Africa, love, spirituality. It's a way for him to share some of his personal reflections alongside the ethnographic accounts.
Can you give me an example?
Well, there's one poem titled Africa that's particularly powerful. He talks about the continent's struggles, but also its resilience and beauty.
It's about acknowledging the whole picture.
It is. And then there's a poem simply titled Love, where he reflects on the nature of love, how it can be both blind and wise, foolish and rich. It's quite beautiful.
It's a universal theme.
It really is.
What else struck you about the poems?
I was intrigued by how he uses poetry to bridge the gap between traditional wisdom and, well, more modern perspectives.
He's drawing from his Mbo upbringing, but also looking at the wider world.
Exactly.
It's time to wrap up our deep dive into Mbu-My-Village. What are your final thoughts?
It's hard not to be impressed by the resilience of the Mbu people. They've faced so many challenges. Migration, conflict, displacement, the arrival of new religions.
And yet they've maintained their sense of identity and community.
They have, and I think there are valuable lessons there for all of us about the importance of preserving cultural diversity and honoring the richness of human experience.
Absolutely. Considering the Mbu people's history, what can we learn from them about preserving cultural heritage, especially in a world where things are becoming increasingly homogenized?
It's important to remember that cultural heritage isn't static. It's a living thing, always evolving. Preserving it requires us to find a balance between honoring tradition and adapting to change.
It's about finding ways to integrate new ideas without losing sight of what makes a culture unique.
Exactly. And it's about making sure those traditions are passed down to future generations.
It's not about clinging to the past, but about making it relevant for the present and the future.
I agree.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive. Thank you so much for sharing your expertise with us.
It was my pleasure. It's always a privilege to talk about cultures that have managed to hold on to their unique traditions in a globalized world.
Before we go, we want to leave our listeners with a final thought to consider. How can we all contribute to preserving cultural diversity in the world?
I think a big part of it is recognizing the value of that diversity, understanding that all these different ways of life, all these different perspectives actually make the world a richer place.
It's about being curious and open to learning from each other, and about challenging our own preconceived notions.
Absolutely. And it's about taking action, supporting initiatives that are working to preserve different cultures, whether it's language revitalization programs, cultural festivals, or documentation of traditional practices.
It's about doing our part, both individually and collectively, to ensure that the richness of human culture continues to thrive.
Well said.
This has been an amazing journey, and we encourage all our listeners to share their thoughts with us on social media. And as always, thanks for joining us on the Deep Dive.
You know, it's amazing how the Mbo have managed to navigate these encounters with other cultures.
Like the Bali, the Germans.
Right, and still they've held on to their own traditions. It really highlights the importance of appreciating all those unique cultures out there.
It's been such a privilege to learn about them. Their story is truly a testament to resilience.
To adaptation, yeah.
And the strength of cultural identity.
It is, and the fact that they've managed to keep those traditions alive despite all those pressures, it's pretty inspiring, you know?
Definitely. There are lessons there for all of us about preserving cultural diversity.
About honoring all the different ways people experience the world.
Exactly. It's a reminder that even with all the forces pushing for sameness, human culture is still so vibrant.
So diverse.
Full of stories waiting to be discovered.
And each one has something to teach us. About ourselves, about history, about how connected we all are. Mbu-My-Village really opened my eyes to a world I knew nothing about.
Me too. And we hope it sparked our listeners' curiosity as well.
To explore, to learn more about those different cultures out there.
Until next time, keep diving deep.